Sorry, students. That last video was cut short. My 3-year-old son was beating on the door, trying to get my attention for something I need to take care of. So, um, the causes of World War II will be broken up into two parts as a result. So, um, what ends up happening with Stalin is starting these collectives, as I mentioned at the end of the first part, that really the farmers got the short end of the stick to benefit the industrial workers. Though on the bright side, one of the only positives of all this is that Russia industrializes more rapidly than any other nation in world history. Now they already were an industrial country, but in terms of they go from like 10th in the world to one of the top three or four in just a short time period. The reason why that happened is because of Stalin and his ruthlessness to make sure that it happened. So as a result of that, though, millions die, starve, sent to Siberian work camps that resisted. But what's interesting is that even though they industrialized more rapidly, they end up having a lower standard of living than they had even before World War One in Russia, and their standard of living was not good. You also have these purges. Anybody that disagreed with them, the Soviet NKVD would come in and purge opponents and so forth of what was taking place. And so these are actually a mass grave here, and the image is fuzzy on purpose so that you couldn't see some of the gore. But it is designed to remove enemies of the states. He would put on these show trials, which anybody that was ever accused was always found guilty. They would hang them in public and leave them hanging in public to send a message to the people to not resist. And so Stalin was ruthless to the local populations throughout the Soviet Union. It's estimated between the time Stalin seized power in 1924 until the start of World War II, about 30 million died from various reasons, from starvation to murder by the NKVD, sent to Siberian death camps and so forth. Particularly one group that he targeted was the Eastern Orthodox Church. There used to be Eastern Orthodox Christian churches throughout Russia, but Stalin began shutting them down with this communist state that was supposed to not have religion. And a lot of the Eastern Orthodox priests and so forth resisted, and they were either killed or sent to the gulags of Siberia, where they were killed there. And so, a lot of these opponents of Stalin were innocent, but with this totalitarian regime, they were able to get away with mass murder. And so they're, in fact, still uncovering mass graves in the Soviet Union, or the former Soviet Union, as a result of the time of Stalin's reign. Now, Spain ends up breaking out into a civil war in the mid-1930s. And so you have some rival factions that are happening. You have the communists within Spain, and they're going to be backed by the Soviet Union and Stalin. And then you had a fascist leader by the name of Francisco Franco, who is supported by the Germans and the Italians. And so Franco actually stayed in power until the early 1970s. But what ends up happening is the Nazis had better weapons, and therefore the fascists ends up winning the Civil War. But it was kind of ruthless. In fact, there were some American citizens who traveled over to Spain and to fight into the Civil War randomly. There wasn't many, but there were some that did that at that time. Now let's talk about Japan. Japan is a unique situation because they do have an emperor. Here is a picture of Emperor Hirohito. And so the various times in Japanese history, the emperor's power kind of changed. So at one point, for a while of Japanese history, the emperor was just kind of a figurehead, but had real no power. By this point, though, in world history, Japan's emperor was seen as almost like a god. And so Japan felt like that they had kind of been screwed with the Treaty of Versailles. In fact, they left the peace proceedings much like Italy did. They had helped the British capture some German colonies in the Pacific and expected to be given land concessions as a result of that. And they are kind of denied that. And so Japan gets mistreated. They also were kind of given the short end of the stick with the Washington Naval Conference and so forth. And what ends up happening is the Japanese kind of feel like they're resentful to a lot of the Western European countries, and to a certain extent, they were a little bit mistreated. but still doesn't justify what they do to China in the 1930s. Now, the guy who's really driving a lot of the Japanese imperialist expansion is the Prime Minister Hideki Tojo. By the 1930s, Japan's government, instead of being more political government, ends up being more of a military government. And he's the one that's going to advocate for this military expansion, along with some other top Japanese military officials. So what causes Japan to want to expand? So you have the problems from World War I, but also secondly is the Great Depression. Japan doesn't get hit by the Great Depression as bad as, say, Britain or Germany or the United States or France or some other country. But they didn't like that their economy was determined based on international markets. Japan knew that they are lacking as an island nation of some of the certain natural resources like rubber and oil and iron ore, copper, among other things. And so they wanted to expand their country and their empire so that way they can get these natural resources quite easily and become economically self-sufficient. So that way their economy wouldn't be based on the international economy, but based on their own empire. And so what's going to end up happening is the Japanese are going to invade Manchuria in 1931. So you could argue that really World War II begins in Asia in 1931. It certainly begins in Asia, if you don't say it begins in 1931, in 1937 when Japan invades the rest of China. And so what ends up happening is Manchuria is going to get invaded in 1931. China is fighting their own kind of civil war themselves. You have the communists led by Mao Zedong fighting against the Guanyamdang government led by Chiang Kai-shek. And so Chinese government is really led by Chiang Kai-shek, is kind of focusing on Mao Zedong's forces with the Long March and pursuing them across the country of China. So when Japan invades in Manchuria in 1931, they're kind of defenseless against the Japanese. And so the Japanese set up this puppet state that they called Manchukuo and so forth. What happens, though, in 1937 is Japan ruthlessly invades the rest of China. And so they claimed that they were provoked and so forth, which they weren't. It was a stage, much like Germany's stage that the Polish attacked them in 1939, which was not true. And so Chiang Kai-shek his forces were further to the west fighting Mao Zedong. He is forced to turn back to the east and try to fight the invading Japanese. But the Japanese are far better militarily with their air force, their tanks, their other military abilities and so forth. And so China is going to be rapidly defeated. Now, what the Chinese will do from 1937 until the war ends in 1945 is they're going to fight a pretty scrappy guerrilla warfare to try to survive. The communists and the Guanyamdang actually stop fighting for a time, and then they'll fight again after the war. But they're going to use guerrilla war tactics against the Japanese. Now, the communists, one reason why they're going to gain popularity after the war is they use more effective guerrilla war tactics, where the Guanyamdang government tried to fight the Japanese in pitched battles and conventional warfare, and they don't do very well. In fact, later in the war, American pilots are going to be sent over there as part of the Flying Tigers unit to help the Chinese and bomb the Japanese military installations and so forth. So the League of Nations condemned both acts. And so what's going to happen is eventually Japan is going to leave the League of Nations. The United States, which is trying to stay isolated at this time, is going to put economic sanctions on Japan, which is one of really the big reason why Japan ends up attacking Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. Now let's talk about one of the most infamous people in world history, Adolf Hitler. So Hitler actually tried to join the Austrian-Hungarian forces during World War I. He was seen as too skinny and not strong enough and fit enough to join the Austrian-Hungarian army. So he goes to Germany and joins the German army during the war. And so he was actually kind of a failed artist in Vienna, which is the capital of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And so he does get gassed during World War I, and actually was recovering in the hospital from that gas attack when the armistice is signed. Now, at one point, there was a British soldier who had a chance to kill him during the war, but doesn't because he was blinded from gas, and that was kind of seen as taking a cheap shot. Of course, wonder what history would have been like if he would have taken the shot. So what ends up happening is once Hitler gets out of the hospital in 1919, he joins the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which is called the Nazis for short. And so he becomes obsessed with fascism and feels like that Germany really gets screwed at the end of World War I with the Treaty of Versailles. And he was part of a plot in 1923 at the height of the inflation to overthrow the German government. He gets arrested for treason, gets sent to prison. And what was crazy is he only served a 9-month sentence, 9 months for a 5-year sentence. He should have been sent to prison for much longer for treason. But while in prison, he writes his infamous work called Mein Kampf, which is German for My Struggle. And in that book, he outlines 3 main issues: that Germany was weakened by certain groups within the country, the Jews particularly, among some other things. But you notice that here in this top left, this is a propaganda poster against the Jews, saying the Jews are trying to take your money and they're communist. So he advocated that the Jews are the big problem. He also advocates that they rebuild the German military and return Germany to a world power. And he also, which we know of in world history from the Holocaust, he proposed purifying the German race by getting rid of all these what he called undesirables in their country. And what's interesting and kind of ironic is what he calls the Aryan race is really somebody that originated from Central Asia. Really what he was thinking of, somebody's more Scandinavian, but nonetheless. So what ends up happening is Hitler runs for the German chancellorship several times, and campaigns he's going to stabilize the country's economic problems, and that what's going to happen is more and more people are going to be swayed by his speaking ability and some of his ideas. Now, when I was a communications major in undergrad, we watched a couple of his speeches in my one of my speaking classes to look at. All we did was look at his kind of mannerisms and so forth for speaking. Now, Hitler would rehearse his speeches for hours and several days, and so what he would do is he would start out his speeches saying things that people didn't disagree with, and so he would kind of motivate them and draw out their emotions, and then once he kind of drew them in emotionally, then he would hit them with his more radical ideas. So by 1930, the Nazi Party had become the second largest party in the German Congress, which is called the Reichstag. In 1932, Hitler lost to a famous World War I general by the name of Hindenburg. And because of political pressure, Hindenburg, who was president, declared Hitler chancellor in 1933, the next year, which is kind of like second in command of the government, almost like the vice presidency. But what ends up happening is Hindenburg dies, and Hitler seizes both the presidency and the German chancellorship and never appoints anybody else. So once Hitler seizes power, he began slowly, the Nazi Party begins passing different laws that gain him more and more power. So they don't do it suddenly all at once. They do it over the course of several years. Also, the German Reichstag burned down, and Hitler blamed the communist radicals for that. And what happens is this sense of chaos, the Reichstag passes different things that give him dictatorial powers. And so Hitler kind of merged the presidency and the chancellorship into one position that he referred to as Der Führer, the leader, and so forth. And he also began to rearm Germany against the Versailles Treaty. Now, one of the things he did is he did make the German economy much better. Because what he did is he began spending vast amounts of money on infrastructure projects. And one of those things happened to be the German Autobahn, which is where Dwight D. Eisenhower got the idea to build the U.S. interstate highway system. Now, the Autobahn is that famous highway system in Germany where there's no speed limit, but it does have more natural curves than our straight interstates do. And so by 1936, the German economy is over the Depression, while the United States is still going with the Depression's ended up having a double-dip recession in 1937. The Nazis also staged these massive rallies, like you can see pictured in the bottom right, to try to create nationalism and so forth, and show the might of the German people. So let's look at the steps that end up leading to World War II beginning in Europe. So World War II begins in Asia before it does in Europe, but World War II in Europe kind of brings in a lot more countries than just Japan and China. So what ends up happening first is in 1936, the German military moves into the Rhineland. The Treaty of Versailles said that they were not allowed to move in that area, but they do anyway. And so what happens is the Allied powers of Britain and France fail to take any action. Now, also in 1936, Mussolini and Hitler enter an alliance, which is called the Rome-Berlin Axis, and so forth. Now, it was thought for a long time in world history after World War II that Britain and France just appeased Hitler and Mussolini because they were gun shy from World War I. That is true to a smaller extent, but really the biggest driving cause of them being okay with the rise of Germany is the Soviet Union actually under Stalin scared them far more than the Germans did at the time. Now later they're going to regret that. They wanted a strong Germany to potentially fight against the powerful Soviet Union led by Stalin. Okay, so in 1938, Germany forced Austria to have an alliance with them, whether Austria liked it or not, because they were German speaking. And said he was creating an alliance between the German people. Now, in Czechoslovakia, there was a part of Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland that's about a majority German-speaking people. He seized that from Czechoslovakia and said they needed more living space for the German people. At this point is when Britain and France ends up meeting with Hitler at the Munich conference, which I'll cover in just a second. So what's the United States doing all of this? Well, the United States, because of World War I and the United States' reason for getting involved in World War I, Congress passed laws that would have prevented the United States from ever getting involved in World War I had this been in place in the 1910s. For instance, in the Neutrality Act of 1935 made it where the United States could not do business with any country that was at war. Okay. Also, it was designed to prevent American civilians from traveling on ships that were owned by countries that were also at war. So the Lusitania wouldn't have killed any Americans if that would have been the case in 1915. They also passed in 1936 that the United States could not give any loans to citizens that were at war. But in 1937, when China gets ruthlessly invaded by Japan, they lightened this up a little bit and they said, okay, well, we will sell stuff to a country at war so long as they pay cash and then come over and get them on their own ships. So China could come to California, pay cash, and carry them on their own vessels, and that the United States would sell war materials to them. Okay, and Britain is going to take advantage of that in 1939. So at the Munich conference, Britain and France met with Hitler. Hitler promised that at the Munich conference to Edward Dallaire of France and Neville Chamberlain, hey, if you let me acquire the Sudetenland, I will not seek any more territory. Well, that was a total lie. In fact, Winston Churchill, the soon-to-be Prime Minister of Britain, said that this was a failure, and that if you give into the Germany's demands, that you're going to regret this. And so he declared a fatal mistake and said it was dishonorable, and he was right. What ends up happening is soon after the Munich conference, Germany goes ahead and seizes all of Czechoslovakia. And Czechoslovakia was actually an ally of Britain and France. So they betrayed their Czechoslovakian allies. And then Britain and France declared to Germany, if you invade any other country, we will have war. And so what ends up happening is Hitler wants to avoid fighting a two-front war. So he creates an alliance with the Soviet Union. Now, it wasn't like that they were buddy-buddy. In fact, Hitler actually hated Stalin and hated the Slavic people of Russia. So what they did is called this 10-year non-aggression pact that basically, like, I'm not going to mess with you if you don't mess with me. And what they agreed is they were going to invade Poland simultaneously. And also Soviet Union was going to invade Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and then also Finland, and carve up the territory between the two of them. So they split Poland in half. And so what happens is in 1939, Germany invades Poland because they're claiming they're getting the free port city of Danzig, which was 90% German, to invade Poland. Now, Poland fights bravely, but they had cavalry charges against tanks. And so Germany defeats them along with the Soviet Union in 2 weeks. And so the question is Poland's military that bad or is Germany that good? Well, it's both. And so World War II begins in Europe on September 1st, 1939, when Germany invades Poland. Of course, the Soviet Union invades Poland as well. So that's when World War II begins in Europe. We've also covered that it begins in Asia when Japan invades China. So we'll come back to this when we get to the rest of World War II.